Hello, everyone. I hope that you're all well and safe. Since the COVID-19 pandemic began a year and a half ago, the world has been grappling with not only a public health emergency, but a crisis of many dimensions. At the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, IGES, we have been engaged in research and activities pertaining to the implications of COVID and the crisis on the environment and sustainability. In particular, in May and December of last year, we have released several position papers that highlight IGES's latest insights and perspectives on this interrelationship between COVID and the environment. Today, we are pleased to announce the release of our third position paper. And to commemorate this, I am joined by Lucille Dufour of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD, and Eric Zussman of IGES to discuss the paper's key messages, its insights, and its relevance to international processes. Lucille and Eric, thank you very much for joining us today. Now, before we begin the discussion, I'd like to briefly introduce these two discussants. Lucille Dufour is Senior Policy Advisor at IISD's Energy Program, and she's currently leading the Energy Policy Tracker, which is a collaborative effort led by IISD to evaluate the greenness of energy policies announced by major economies since the pandemic began. She's joining us today from France, and she'll be explaining some of this, hopefully, in due course. Eric Zussman, on the other hand, is research leader of the governance team of IGES's Integrated Sustainability Center and is also the lead author of this position paper, as well as core authors of the previous position papers. Eric is joining us from Japan, as am I. My name is Erin Kawazu, and I am Program Coordinator at the Strategic Management Office at IGES, and I will be moderating the discussion today. Okay. Now let's get started. So the first question I'd like to address to Eric. You are the lead author of this paper, and you have been a major contributor, as I said, to the previous two position papers. Can you please briefly describe the main points of the previous papers and how this particular one that we're releasing builds on these previous works that we've done?
Okay, thank you so much, Erin, and thank you for moderating our talk today. So, as suggested, we've authored three different papers on COVID and the environment. The first one of these papers came shortly after the sort of initial wave of lockdowns. And one of the things that we realized during that period is that there were strong linkages and relationships between COVID and the environment. These were not only in terms of, some of the discussion about how COVID had potentially been attributable to transmission of the virus between animals and humans, but also in ways that people perhaps didn't anticipate. So for instance, we saw an increase in medical waste and how are countries going to deal with this medical waste. Or to highlight another example, during the lockdowns, we saw significant reductions in urban air pollution, especially in some of these rapidly motorizing cities where air pollution poses a big threat to health. And so we tried to highlight these linkages, but one of the key messages we tried to deliver in that paper is that policymakers should not only pay attention to these sort of immediate implications on the environment, but they need to think, sort of near term, also need to think a little bit in the medium term, especially when we start talking about, some of the stimulus funding, and then also thinking sort of long term. So we need to think about measures that apply across different timescales. And this long-term dimension is particularly important for sustainability. And I think this led us into the second position paper. And the second position paper sort of picked up on that theme of thinking long-term, but we wanted to give policymakers a framework, a coherent framework, a way of thinking about how they could pair together different decisions that would lead to sort of a more long-term sustainable set of outcomes for environment, for people, for the planet more generally. And what we did is we put together what we call our triple R framework. This triple R framework was composed of three different elements. One was the response. So we wanted to make sure, of course, that the policymakers took care of sort of the immediate needs of the health of their citizens, and that, you know, perhaps dealing with some of the medical waste issues mentioned previously, but then also thought about, you know, a green recovery. And then perhaps the last and perhaps most unique element here was what we call the redesign. And the redesign here was really thinking about how do we take advantage of the opportunity that lies in this crisis and this window of opportunity and keep it open in a way that would enable us to ensure, you know, a sustainable future for, you know, not only us, but our children and our grandchildren. And the redesign element, I think what's really important here is to emphasize that it was key for governments to invest in not only infrastructure that would have, you know, sort of long-term impact. So not only using COVID in a way and stimulus funds in a way to redesign their cities, you know, and make sure that they're climate proof and climate resilient, but also redesign their institutions. And so, for instance, to give a very illustrative example, is to make sure that the institutions that were bringing resources from the national government down to the local government to support some of these greener investments, that those institutions were strong, robust, and that they would continue long beyond not only this pandemic, but continue into the future in a way that would prevent future pandemics. So strengthening infrastructure and institutions are core elements of the redesign, and this was really important to our second paper. And I think this really opened the door for our third paper, where we start to talk a lot more about planetary health and some of the actionable and ambitious recommendations that are outlined in that paper. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next set of questions, but I'll stop there for right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yes, I think you gave a really great overview of the evolution of this position paper series. And just to segue, in all of these, I believe, all of these position papers, we have referred to the energy policy tracker as one key insight that we have on green recovery or lack thereof. And so my question, the next question is for Lucille. You're leading this initiative called the Energy Policy Tracker, and IGES has also played a part in supporting this effort, and we have, as I said, continually cited its findings. Can you briefly describe this initiative in perhaps a little more detail and its main findings?
I can do that, and I'm also going to share my screen so that you can see some of our main findings. So the Energy Policy Tracker, as you presented it in the introduction, it's this online platform that tracks recovery response and policy response to COVID-19 in different geographies. And we launched the Energy Policy Tracker in July 2020 with 5 other co-organizations, including the International Institute for Sustainable Development and IGES, with the objective of bringing transparency to the recovery policies that were adopted by governments, but also to hold them accountable to the different commitments that they made around building back better, for instance. Since the beginning of the project, the Energy Policy Tracker has expanded a lot. We now have more than 25 research partners around the world tracking energy policies, and we cover 31 countries and 8 multilateral development banks. And if you go on our online platform, you will find more than 1,500 policies. So we've really built a very substantial database of policy, mostly focusing on energy production and consumption in the key sectors that are related to these kind of measures, including buildings, resource extraction, power, and transport. So this is really what the Energy Policy Tracker is about, and you'll see also that one of our key features is that apart from tracking these COVID-19 response, we also sort them depending on the type of energy that they are supporting. So either fossil fuel energy, and this is also a proxy for us to understand the potential environmental impact of these kind of policies, or clean energy and other kind of energy that we track. And I'm directly going to turn into the main findings of the energy policy tracker and show you one of the flagship graphics that you can find on our website. I will focus my presentation on the G20 because they are the most relevant countries that have approved energy policies since the beginning of the pandemic, with the largest amounts and obviously the largest potential impact on the sustainability of our economies in the future. So when we look into the key findings, and you will see what we call very informally the country or donut in the energy policy tracker, the first thing that is really key to say is that what this shows is that unprecedented amount of money were made available by these countries to respond to the direct consequences of the crisis, and especially in the energy sectors. So in the G20, we have more than $700 billion that were approved since the beginning of the pandemic in January 2020. So we're really talking about huge public financial flows in different sectors that will have a big impact on the energy systems in the future. What is also key to say is that, as you can see on this graph, on this graphic, there is still more public money commitments that were approved to fossil fuel intensive activities in G20 countries and more globally on the energy policy tracker than in clean energy. So what it shows is that actually global recovery response is still not aligned with one, achieving a fossil-free recovery, and also building a more sustainable net zero and resilient future in the coming years. So obviously this means that there's much more effort that are needed from these countries, and especially G20, and I will turn to this later in this webinar hopefully. But there are also more positive trends, especially the fact that what we've seen over the past month is that recovery spending allocated to green commitments has increased substantially over time. So at the beginning of the pandemic, when these countries started allocated large amount of money to COVID response, we had about 7% of the stimulus tracked on the energy policy tracker that was allocated to clean energy. And in the last months, we have reached about 36%. Of total stimulus. So we can see here that there has been a progressive shift from very fossil fuel intensive recovery to greener recovery from these countries. And obviously it was in many cases driven by pre-existing frameworks to support the energy and climate transition, or by regulations that were put in place by different countries. And I will turn to the last finding that I wanted to present, which is an overview of what different countries have been doing, especially in G20. Here, what's really important to note is that there is no single country that has a fully green track record when it came to responding to the COVID crisis. What's interesting to see is that some countries have been doing better than others, as I said, because they had either pre-existing framework in place. For instance, in the European Union, the climate targets that were already in place fostered a green recovery, but we can also name other countries that after the beginning of the crisis put in place regulations to make sure that recovery would become greener. This is the case in Canada. This is also the case in the United States. We cannot see it here because the infrastructure plan has not been approved yet, but this is the kind of trends that we can see. So these are the main findings in a nutshell. I will not go into sectoral findings, etc., because we don't have time here. But if there is one key message to remember is that efforts have been made to green the recovery, but obviously much more still can be done to, achieve this kind of green and sustainable recovery that we are looking forward to, and also to integrate multidimensional approaches in that kind of approach to building back better.
Wow, thank you so much. When the energy policy tracker was first released, I think we were all quite shocked at the amount of funding that was still going into fossil fuels. And it's really great to hear that at least some progress has been made. And like you said, things could get a lot better going forward. So now I kind of want to pivot to a key concept that we have dealt with in the position paper itself. So, and that is planetary health, or the One Health approach. Planetary health, for those who are unfamiliar with this concept, is a public health discipline that considers the health of natural or environmental systems as foundational to human health and well-being. One approach to make sure this happens is the One Health approach, which is an interdisciplinary approach that deals with complex issues like this pandemic, for example, by integrating aspects from environmental health, animal health, and human health. So these two concepts have been around for quite some time, but they've gained traction in the past few years. And so I would like to ask Eric first, why this concept, why you believe this concept has become even more important in the COVID era, especially when it comes to policymakers in this region, but perhaps globally as well.
Okay, thank you so much for this question, Erin, and for those definitions. I think that helps set up the discussion quite nicely. So the reason I think that this concept has become increasingly important is, I mean, even though, you know, we see the impacts, for instance, of climate change or air pollution, water pollution, those impacts we see, you know, they become a little bit more salient over time. A lot of times I think policymakers, and especially politicians, can look past environmental problems because they're not the type of thing that you can see how they affect the health of humans directly and immediately. But this idea of planetary health, I think, helps to put together this, you know, importance of public health and the health of the environment in a single concept, in a single framing that can motivate policymakers and politicians to take action. So I think that's why it's important. I think another critical reason that it's important is it not only provides that framing, but it brings together professionals from environmental community, the public health community, and also the animal health community in ways that can help also motivate policymakers and politicians to make decisions that will, you know, protect the environment and health and animals. So I think in terms of framing, and then in terms of providing some cohesive glue between these different groups, I think it's important. This leads me to the sort of next point, though, and this is something we touch upon in the paper. I think there's a slight distinction in some ways between the planetary health approach, which has at its core sort of a very ambitious outlook on what needs to be done in order to protect the environment, and is really motivating, you know, different types of groups, politicians at the international level, social movements at the local level, to do big things. And I think having that ambition is really important. At the same time, the One Health approach, and this is a little bit where we get this actionable idea in the title of our paper, promotes perhaps a little bit more narrower, but also sort of pragmatic actions. And so I think what we're trying to argue in our paper is that this framing is important to motivate action, but we need some pragmatism that's combined with some ambition. And some of the pragmatic things that we recommend, that we see that are already happening, that should be perhaps promoted more, range from some regulation of wet markets, where some of the bushmeat is sold and might have possibly contributed to the initial spread of COVID. They also include using wastewater treatment facilities as a way to track not only COVID, but other viruses. And then they also range to things like investing in green retrofit programs for buildings. So these are quite concrete, actionable things that policymakers can do in the wake of COVID and perhaps even past COVID that will be good for the environment and public health, and in some cases also good for animal health. At the same time, we also need to have sort of a very ambitious outlook on what we need to do to make sure these things sustain themselves and keep on working in ways to prevent future pandemics. And towards the end of the paper, we highlight two different points that I think are consistent with this more ambitious view. One is focusing a lot on sectoral integration, making sure that there's multi-level and multi-stakeholder governance arrangements that are in place to help the different agencies that are working on these issues to collaborate in an effective manner. And not only within one level of government, but between national and local level. That comes back a little bit to some of the redesign elements I discussed previously. So some institutional changes that promote sectoral integration I think are really important. And then also some reforms that promote social inclusion. So one of the things that we don't want to happen with some of the measures that we're recommending is to create and widen disparities between different groups or different people. And we have some concerns about that. The paper talks a little bit about this idea of a K-shaped recovery. And we want to make sure that the policymaking institutions provide opportunities for different social groups to get more included in decisions. And this can help promote things such as the just transition. And it can also help promote things at even sort of smaller scale. For instance, we see a lot more emphasis these days on citizen science. And so we think that sectoral integration and social inclusion are sort of core of this more ambitious outlook, or core to this more ambitious outlook. And they need to be married with some of the more actionable recommendations, some of the things that we already see happening in the wake of COVID and the stimulus packages. And by combining these sort of actionable and ambitious set of reforms, we think that we can help realize this vision of a healthy planet and people. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think your last point about environmental health justice essentially is critical. And I think this tie-in between both planetary health, but really more specifically what is happening on the ground to specific vulnerable communities is something that we really have to pay more attention to going forward. So Lucille, I would like to ask you the same question with your takes on planetary health or One Health approach, perhaps what you've noticed in Europe or elsewhere. What are your takes?
Yes, thanks very much. And also thank you for bringing forward this concept, because I think it's a really useful one to think, the recovery response and the way governments are responding to the COVID-19 pandemic at the moment. And what I'm really interested in here is how to operationalize this concept into the kind of stimulus responses that we are seeing and that we've been seeing, especially in the energy policy tracker. And I think that there are two keywords to that. And the first one is building resilience, which I think should be at the core of this kind of planetary health approach, and also the multidimensionality of response. And what I think has been really interesting is that the COVID-19 pandemic has helped shifting the narrative at the international level. And we can really see it in the international community that a large part of government representatives, countries, institutions have voiced their support to building back better and a green recovery in a way that is encompassing different dimensions of what the response should be. And I think that it can also be seen through the convergence of different agendas at the international level, including through the processes with the CBD COP focused on biodiversity and the COP focused on climate, and you know, this kind of efforts to think through what it means to both protect the climate and biodiversity at the same time, and what it can bring to our society. So this shift in the discourse and in the recognition of these linkages between the climate, biodiversity, or ecosystems, and also, on the other hand, human health and social and economic stability is already here in the political landscape. Now, I think the missing piece is the disconnect that is still here between this recognition and the actions and implementation that we've seen in the recovery responses. And to explain my point here, based on what the Energy Policy Tracker has, on the data that the Energy Policy Tracker has collected, I think that many approaches that we've seen when government were implementing the Build Back Better principles is many policies that were solely focusing on measures that would tackle the climate crisis through mitigation and aiming at reducing, you know, GHG emissions in different countries. And here there's maybe a bit of a lost opportunity, because these policies really focusing on the energy transition and sustainability will only achieve their full potential if they are implemented hand in hand with the inclusion and integration of complementary dimensions, including biodiversity, social justice, and also between countries solidarity approaches. And I can give like a really small example of a policy. For instance, when we see in the Energy Policy Tracker in the European context, a lot of or even in the global south, more interestingly, some policies that are supporting the installation of new renewable energy capacities. It's obviously going to have a positive impact on the environment and on avoiding GHG emissions. But what a lot of policymakers miss at the moment is how we better target this kind of policies so that they target the most vulnerable communities and improve energy access, and a lot of other SDGs such as health access, etc. How they can also create more economic stability through job creations if they are well targeted spatially, and how they can also make sure that there is a biodiversity dimension that is added to it to improve resilience into the ecosystems and avoid some of the negative impacts that could be created through the implementation of such policies. So just to come back to the main point and here, I think that this is really a call to policymakers to really think about the multidimensionality of the response to COVID-19, and this is potentially something that has not been done enough since the beginning of the pandemic. This can be done through a variety of tools, including from the policy design stages, improving transparency, improving tracking of policies and their impact. And there's a lot to be done here to make sure that the Build Back Better approach is really fully integrated into the planetary health approach as well.
Thank you so much. Yes, I 100% agree with that. And it actually brings us to the next question, final question on international processes. And you've already kind of explained some of the important parts about integration in these international processes, but I would like to kind of take a step back and say, at least for this particular position paper, it will be launched, or it was launched after the United Nations General Assembly, which was recently completed. And at the UNGA, they have also highlighted several important issues that we have covered here today: COVID recovery, climate, planetary health, what have you. And the UNGA is also an important political space for global mobilization and agenda setting. And so it would be important to link some of the findings that we have presented as institutes and see how these translate to, I guess, practice. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Eric and Lucille about how such international processes, especially in Eric's case, perhaps I'll start with you, Eric, how international processes, especially those that are relevant to the SDGs or perhaps after the SDGs, how these can encourage policymakers to make sure that we are actually fully integrating planetary health or other key redesign concepts into our, I guess, future agenda.
Thanks so much for that, Erin. It's a very stimulating question. And so let me start off by just touching upon the UNGA and then thinking a little bit about SDGs and post-2030 SDGs, perhaps. So first of all, the United Nations General Assembly concluded on the 27th of September. And as noted, I mean, it was a very rich and fruitful agenda where, I mean, of course, COVID issues were discussed, but also their broader linkages to planetary health. And one of the key things that happened at the UNGA, in addition to some very encouraging announcements from the US and China on climate change, was the release of this new report called Our Common Agenda. So the Secretary General released this report at the very beginning of the UNGA, highlighting 12 different areas that the UN would help to implement. This comes actually after the UNGA last year, which was celebrating the 75th anniversary of the UN. So many of these areas are focusing on strengthening the UN system and strengthening multilateralism itself. But one of the 12 is focusing on protecting our planet. And so we think that, you know, I would strongly encourage viewers to take a look at this report, not only because of its content, but because I think it might also offer a framework for potential post-2030 development agenda and post-2030 SDGs. And the reason I think it's important is, unfortunately, if we look at the 17 sustainable development goals that are in place right now and that are supposed to guide our actions up to 2030, the progress has not been so good. And, you know, basically, I think there's some reports that suggest that up to, if we want to achieve these goals at our current rate, we'd have to wait up to 2073. So, I mean, I don't think I'm going to make it. And I would like very much to you know, see the realization of some of these goals. So, I mean, one way of dealing with that, of course, would be to perhaps take a step back and reduce some of our ambition levels. But as already suggested, because we're not reaching the goals is not really a good reason to tamp down some of the ambition. In fact, I think you know, we need to think a little bit more creatively about the way that the goals are structured and what might be the implications for some of the issues that are likely to confront us, you know, for the next 20 to 30 years. And, you know, one issue that I think is particularly salient in this regard, and something that we've done a lot of work here on at IGES, is the linkages between air pollution, climate change, and health. And, you know, one of the things I think we'd like to see considered more strongly, not only in our common agenda, but perhaps as part of the post-2030 agenda, is what we're calling a one atmosphere approach. And this one atmosphere approach would pay a lot more attention to the linkages between air pollution, climate change, and health, and also potentially to some of the social issues. So for instance, in Asia, one of the things that, you know, and this is actually not exclusive to Asia, but one of the things that we see as particularly problematic is that, you know, for air pollution problems, women and children tend to be more exposed to air pollution, especially indoor air pollution, in large part because they rely some countries very heavily on cook stoves. And so this type of issue is not captured so well in the current set of SDGs. But these same cook stoves that cause air pollution, they also contribute to climate change. And so if we can have a more integrated approach to the way that we deal with the atmosphere, we can also ensure that some of the resources that are coming from growing pools of climate finance can help address some of these concerns. And so for me, one atmosphere approach should be something that's featured prominently in a post-2030 agenda. Once again, I think, COVID in some ways creates an opportunity, a window of opportunity to start thinking more creatively about how we structure the agenda to achieve some of these things. I think it also, this type of thinking also is sort of core towards preventing, future pandemics. I look forward to having a dialogue with some of our colleagues at IISD and other core organizations on this new, way of structuring the development agenda that's both ambitious and, to come back to the title of the paper, also actionable. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, I think that's very important. I like the one atmosphere approach. I think that is a good way forward. So I'd like to ask Lucille the same question, but perhaps focusing on the G20, which where your work is mostly focused.
Yeah, thank you very much. And obviously, the G20 is coming up at the end of October on the 30th of October, the Heads of State Leaders Summit, and just followed by COP. And we think as ISD that these two moments are key opportunities to promote more greener recovery and also potentially to promote this concept of planetary health. The G20 is particularly relevant as a space just because the G20 countries, as I said earlier, have channeled most of the COVID response funding since the beginning of the pandemic. So they are the ones who hold in hand the cards to green the recovery and also put in place more sustainable approaches. And as I said, they are also still falling short of putting together this sustainable framework around the COVID-19 response. And this is why we really expect those countries to use the upcoming international moments to adopt commitments towards a fossil-free recovery that will create jobs, protect ecosystems, the global health, and also fosters a just energy transition that leaves no one behind. So this is the key principle that should really underpin all the discussions at the G20 meeting that is upcoming, and we have developed as ISD some key recommendations, including through our flagship report that was published earlier in March on the fossil-free recovery that just indicate some of the steps that G20 countries could take to achieve this kind of fossil fuel recovery and also bring the co-benefits that this approach would entail. And so these steps include divesting from fossil fuel production, which would be the #1 approach to avoid all of the negative impacts of fossil fuel consumption and production, and then shift the entire policy framework to reform fossil fuel subsidies, support clean energy and the job creations that they will bring about, and ensure just transition for the workers and also the affected communities to promote the sustainable development goals as well. So these are really the expectations that we have for the G20, and we really think that they can promote this approach to building back better in a multi-dimensional way. Now, when it comes to COP, I also wanted to highlight the fact that the G20 is really important, but we also need to take into account all the other countries, and especially the ones in the global south. And what we've seen since the beginning of the pandemic is that these countries have been less able than industrialized countries to channel recovery funding in their economy because of smaller fiscal spaces, rising level of debts, and it really underlines the need to create global solidarity between countries in the global north and countries in the global south, so that we enable a more equitable and just green recovery worldwide, and not only in those industrialized countries. And the COP26, I think, is going to be extremely relevant in that regard. Developed countries have many ways to put in place this global solidarity through mechanisms that will be discussed at COP, including delivering on the climate finance goal, the $100 billion goal that is supposed to be mobilized every year until 2025, but also in terms of thinking about debt cancellation mechanisms that can be also discussed in the G20. But this kind of frameworks and tools should be considered to really make sure that we're getting into a recovery that is just and fair and equitable globally. And this will also make sure that actually the planetary health approach is not only thought at the national level, but at the global level. And I think this is where also it makes much more sense because of the multidimensional approach that it promotes.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, and I think in terms of just marrying both of those views together, my thought is that planetary health is, I guess, a really potentially quite powerful in helping to tag financing to achieve multiple co-benefits. And if we could achieve that somehow at international processes, we're not just talking about national level planetary health, but we're talking about global, really planetary health. So that is a really powerful kind of ambition to go forth. So I'd like to keep this discussion going. There's so much we can still cover here, but we are almost out of time. So I'd like to just take this time to thank you both, Eric and Lucille, for joining us today and for contributing your valuable insights and perspectives on all of these issues. So because we really didn't get to go through a lot that we could have covered today, I'd like to just remind people that they can you see that? So I'd like to just remind people that you can access our paper, the newest position paper, Actionable Recommendations and Ambitious Directions for Restoring Planetary Health in the COVID Era, here by accessing the QR code or using the link below. And just to also remind people, the Energy Policy Tracker led by ISD is a great resource for understanding how public money, especially in the G20, is going to the right places or maybe the wrong ones. And this is a great way of keeping our economies, or the major economies of the world, accountable for their commitments towards net zero or other green recovery or building back better initiatives. So without further ado, I'd like to just thank you both again for your insights, and I'd like to thank all the viewers for listening to our discussion today. Take care, and if you can, take care of someone else too. Thank you.